she whispered. "I'm too old for this." But the young cowboy stayed the night. Western love story. The small western town of Silver Creek rested quietly between wide golden fields and low dusty hills. Most days were slow there. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. Horses walked lazily near the barns, and the people in town knew almost everyone by name. On the far edge of Silver Creek stood an old wooden ranch house. The paint on the walls had faded over the years, and the long fence around the land had started to lean in some places. But the ranch was still strong, just like the woman who lived there. Her name was Margaret Hale. Margaret was known in Silver Creek as a hard-working woman. She had lived on the ranch for most of her life. Years ago, she and her husband had built the place together. They raised horses, fixed barns, and spent long days working under the warm western sun. But time had passed. Her husband had been gone for many years now, and Margaret had continued to run the ranch alone. She woke up early every morning, fed the horses, checked the fences, and took care of the land. Even though the work was hard, she never complained. Still, the ranch had grown very quiet. That evening, the sky above Silver Creek turned soft shades of orange and pink as the sun slowly moved toward the hills. Margaret stood near the fence, trying to repair one of the wooden boards that had broken after a recent windstorm. She held a hammer in her hand and worked carefully, but the board was heavy and stubborn. Margaret paused for a moment and wiped the dust from her hands. She looked across the wide land that stretched far beyond her ranch. "I guess I'm getting too old for this kind of work," she whispered softly to herself. At that same moment, a lone rider appeared on the dirt road that led toward town. The rider was a young cowboy named Daniel Carter. Daniel had been traveling for many days. His horse moved slowly, tired from the long journey across the open plains. Dust covered Daniel's boots and hat, but his eyes were calm and curious as he looked toward the quiet town ahead. Silver Creek was not a big place. Just a few wooden buildings, a general store, a small cafe, and a stable near the road. Daniel planned to stop only for the night. Cowboys like him often moved from town to town, helping where they could and continuing their journey the next morning. As he rode closer, he noticed a ranch house standing just outside the town, and he noticed Margaret struggling with the broken fence. Daniel gently pulled the reins of his horse and stopped. For a moment, he watched as Margaret tried again to lift the wooden board into place. The wind pushed lightly against the fence, making the task even harder. Without thinking much about it, Daniel guided his horse toward the ranch. "Evening, ma'am," he said politely as he climbed down from the saddle. Margaret looked up, a little surprised to see a stranger standing near her fence. "Evening," she replied calmly. Daniel tipped his hat slightly in greeting. "Looks like that fence is giving you some trouble," he said with a friendly smile. Margaret gave a small laugh. "You could say that. The wind last week didn't do it any favors." Daniel stepped closer and looked at the board. "If you don't mind," he said, "I'd be happy to help." Margaret studied the young cowboy for a moment. Travelers passed through Silver Creek sometimes, but not many stopped to help with ranch work. Still, something about Daniel seemed honest and respectful. "Well," she said gently, stepping aside, "I won't stop you if you're offering." Daniel picked up the board and held it steady while Margaret handed him the hammer. Working together, they quickly fixed the broken piece of the fence. Within a few minutes, the fence stood straight again. Daniel wiped the dust from his hands and stepped back to look at their work. "That should hold for a while," he said. Margaret nodded. "Thank you, cowboy." She leaned lightly against the fence and sighed. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to fix these things by myself without thinking twice." She paused and looked toward the fading sunset. "But these days," she added softly, "I'm too old for this." Daniel heard the words, but he didn't laugh or disagree. Instead, he simply looked across the ranch land. The place was peaceful. Horses grazed slowly in the distance, and the evening wind carried the smell of dry grass. "It's a beautiful ranch," Daniel said. Margaret followed his gaze. "It used to be a busy one," she replied. "Life was louder here once." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet evening settled gently around them. Daniel's horse shifted its weight and gave a soft snort. Margaret noticed how tired the animal looked. "You've been riding a long way," she said. Daniel nodded. A few days on the trail. Margaret thought for a moment, then looked back at the young cowboy. Well, she said kindly, a horse that tired deserve a good rest. She gestured toward the barn. You can keep him in the stable tonight. Daniel blinked in surprise. You sure about that? Margaret smiled faintly. And a traveler probably shouldn't sleep out on the cold ground either. She pointed toward the ranch house. There's a small guest room inside. Daniel hesitated, not wanting to impose. But Margaret spoke again before he could refuse. It's been a long time since this ranch had any company. Daniel looked at the quiet ranch, then back at Margaret. Thank you, ma'am, he said warmly. As the last light of the sunset faded over Silver Creek, the young cowboy led his horse toward the barn. The evening grew cooler as the sun disappeared behind the hills of Silver Creek. A soft wind moved through the open fields, carrying the quiet sounds of the ranch. Inside the barn, Daniel Carter carefully brushed the dust from his tired horse. The animal seemed happy to finally rest after many long days on the trail. Daniel filled the water bucket and placed fresh hay in the stall. Rest well, partner, Daniel said softly while patting the horse's neck. Not far away, a few horses from Margaret's ranch stood calmly in their pens. The barn smelled of dry hay and old wood. It felt peaceful, the kind of place where time moved slowly. When Daniel finished in the barn, he walked toward the ranch house. Warm light glowed from the windows, and smoke rose gently from the small chimney. It had been a long time since someone outside Margaret's life had stepped into that house. Daniel knocked lightly on the door. Come in. Margaret's voice called from inside. Daniel stepped into the house and removed his hat politely. The room was simple but warm. A small wooden table stood near the window, and an old clock ticked slowly on the wall. Margaret was standing near the stove, stirring a pot. I hope you don't mind a simple meal, she said while turning toward him. Ranch cooking isn't fancy. Daniel smiled. After days on the trail, simple food sounds perfect. Margaret placed 2 plates on the table. The meal was warm stew with fresh bread. The smell filled the room, making the quiet house feel more alive than it had in years. They sat across from each other at the table. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle ticking of the clock and the soft wind outside. Daniel took a bite of the stew and nodded. This is really good, he said honestly. Margaret chuckled lightly. You must be very hungry then. Daniel laughed quietly. The small joke broke the silence, and the room felt more comfortable. After a few minutes, Margaret spoke again. So, young cowboy, she said, where you headed? Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. I'm not exactly sure, he answered. I've been riding from town to town, helping where I can. Margaret looked curious. Helping with what? Anything that needs doing, Daniel replied. Fixing fences, repairing barns, caring for horses. My grandfather taught me most of it when I was young. Margaret listened with interest. Sounds like you've seen a lot of places. Daniel nodded slowly. I've seen deserts, mountains, and little towns that look a lot like Silver Creek. Margaret gave a small smile. Well, Silver Creek isn't the most exciting place in the world. Daniel glanced around the house. Sometimes quiet places are the best ones. Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the window, where the night sky had started to appear. The stars were slowly filling the sky above the plains. After dinner, Daniel helped clear the table without being asked. Margaret noticed this and appreciated the kindness. Soon they stepped outside onto the wooden porch. The air had turned cool, but the sky above them was bright with stars. Out on the open plains, the world looked wide and peaceful. Margaret sat down in an old wooden chair, and Daniel leaned against the porch railing. For a while, they both simply looked at the sky. It's been a long time since I sat out here with someone, Margaret said quietly. Daniel looked toward her. You live here alone? Margaret nodded. My husband and I built this ranch many years ago. We worked the land together. Her voice remained calm, but Daniel could tell the memories were important to her. The ranch used to be busy, she continued. Workers, horses, wagons coming and going. Daniel imagined the place full of life. But things change, Margaret added softly. The wind moved gently through the grass, and a horse neighed quietly in the distance. After a moment, Margaret gave a small laugh. You know something funny? She said. "What's that?" Daniel asked. She looked at him with a gentle smile. "I thought my days of meeting cowboys were long behind me." Daniel smiled back. "Well, the trail has a way of surprising people." Margaret shook her head slightly. "You're young," she said kindly. "You should be out chasing adventure." Then she looked at the dark fields stretching across the land. "And here you are, spending the night at an old ranch with someone like me." Daniel thought about her words for a moment. Then he spoke calmly. "Sometimes the trail leads a cowboy exactly where he needs to be." Margaret looked at him, a little surprised by the answer. Daniel wasn't speaking like someone who felt stuck there. Instead, he sounded comfortable, as if he didn't mind the quiet ranch at all. The wind grew softer as the night deepened. For the first time in many years, the porch of the old ranch house wasn't silent. There was quiet conversation. There was gentle laughter. And inside the house, the warm light from the windows stretched across the wooden floor. As the night continued, Margaret finally stood up. "You must be tired after all that riding," she said. Daniel nodded slightly. "Just a little." Margaret pointed down the hallway. "The guest room is the second door on the right." Daniel picked up his hat. "Thank you again for the meal and the place to stay." Margaret gave a small nod. "It's been nice having someone around." Daniel walked down the hallway toward the guest room. The wooden floor creaked softly under his boots. Meanwhile, Margaret remained on the porch for a moment longer. She looked across the quiet ranch under the bright stars. For years, the place had felt lonely, but tonight felt different. There was a horse resting in the barn, a cowboy sleeping in the guest room. The first light of morning slowly spread across the wide plains of Silver Creek. The sky turned soft shades of gold and pale blue as the sun began to rise over the hills. Birds started singing in the trees near the ranch house, and the quiet land slowly woke up. Inside the small guest room, Daniel Carter opened his eyes as the sunlight came through the window. Cowboys were used to waking early. And even after the long ride, Daniel was already used to the rhythm of ranch life. He sat up, stretched his arms, and listened. The ranch was peaceful. Somewhere outside, a horse moved softly in the barn. Daniel put on his boots and hat, then quietly stepped out of the room so he wouldn't disturb Margaret Hale. The wooden floor creaked softly as he walked through the house and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and fresh. Daniel took a deep breath and looked across the ranch land. The field stretched far into the distance, glowing in the early sunlight. Near the fence, he noticed something. One of the gates was hanging slightly crooked. Daniel smiled a little. "Looks like this place could use a few extra hands," he said quietly to himself. He walked to the barn first to check on his horse. The animal lifted its head when Daniel entered and gave a soft sound. "Morning, partner," Daniel said, patting the horse's neck. After feeding the horses and filling their water buckets, Daniel grabbed a small toolbox he had seen near the barn wall. Soon he was working on the loose gate. The wood creaked as he lifted it back into place. With careful movements, he tightened the hinges and straightened the posts. Not long after, the gate stood firm again. At that moment, Margaret opened the front door of the ranch house. She stepped onto the porch with a warm cup of coffee in her hand. For a second, she simply looked across the land. Then she noticed Daniel near the gate. He was already working. Margaret watched quietly for a moment, surprised. She walked down from the porch and slowly made her way across the yard. "Good morning, Cowboy," she called out. Daniel turned and tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am." Margaret looked at the gate he had just fixed. "You didn't have to start working this early," she said. Daniel shrugged lightly. Hard to ignore something that needs fixing. Margaret looked at the gate, then at the barn, then back at Daniel. "You remind me of someone," she said thoughtfully. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Margaret smiled softly. "My husband." Daniel didn't say anything right away. He simply listened. "He used to wake up before the sun," Margaret continued. "Always said the ranch worked better when someone cared enough to start the day early." Daniel nodded. "Sounds like a smart man." Margaret looked across the land again. For a moment, she seemed lost in old memories. Then she cleared her throat. "Well," she said, "if you're already awake, you might as well join me for breakfast." Daniel smiled. "That sounds like a good idea." A short time later, They sat together at the kitchen table again. This time the morning sunlight filled the room, making the old house feel warm and bright. Margaret placed eggs, bread, and coffee on the table. "You didn't have to fix that gate," she said again while pouring coffee. Daniel shrugged. "Cowboys get restless if they sit too long." Margaret laughed quietly. "That explains a lot." After breakfast, Margaret stood and picked up her hat. "Well," she said, "I usually check on the horses after breakfast." Daniel stood up as well. "Mind if I come along?" Margaret looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Sure." Soon they were walking across the open field toward the horse pens. The horses lifted their heads when they saw Margaret. They were used to her calm presence. Daniel watched how gently she handled the animals. "You've taken good care of this place," he said. Margaret brushed one horse's mane with her hand. "It hasn't been easy alone," she admitted. Daniel noticed something then. Near the far side of the field, a section of the fence had started leaning. He pointed toward it. "That fence might need some attention soon." Margaret sighed softly. "Yes, I noticed that yesterday." She looked at the long fence lines stretching across the land. "There's always something that needs fixing on a ranch." Daniel studied the fence for a moment. Then he smiled. "Well, lucky for you, there's a cowboy here who knows a little about fences." Margaret laughed again, shaking her head. "You sure you're not planning to charge me for all this work?" Daniel grinned. "Not today." The two of them spent the rest of the morning walking around the ranch, checking the barn, the water pump, and the grazing horses. Daniel fixed a loose board on the barn wall and tightened a few ropes near the stable. Margaret watched him work with quiet amazement. For years, she had done everything by herself. Now, suddenly, someone was helping without even being asked. By midday, the ranch looked better than it had in months. Margaret stood on the porch, watching Daniel finish repairing a small wooden post near the fence. The ranch didn't feel quite as lonely anymore. The sound of hammering, the movement of horses, and the quiet conversation had filled the empty space. Daniel walked back toward the porch and wiped the dust from his hands. "That should hold for a while," he said. Margaret nodded slowly. "You've done more in one morning than I've managed in weeks." Daniel looked out across the peaceful land. "It's a good ranch," he said. Margaret followed his gaze. For the first time in many years, the old ranch didn't feel like a place slowly fading away. Instead, it felt like something waking up again. And though neither of them said it out loud, both Margaret and Daniel knew something had quietly changed that morning. The ranch was no longer just a quiet place on the edge of town.